The 2025 silly season is shaping up to be one of the most interesting yet. A few seats are currently available at top teams, with driver contracts expiring at the end of this year at Red Bull, Mercedes and Aston Martin. Most drivers will have an eye on the seat currently occupied by Sergio Perez at Red Bull. It's currently the most competitive car on the F1 grid, and there's a chance that Perez won't be able to renew his contract. Daniel Ricciardo is rebuilding his F1 career racing for RB, trying to prove once again that he's capable of taking the seat that he left vacant in 2018, but it seems like he's struggling to prove himself in Formula 1 once again. So where's the real Daniel Ricciardo gone? Let's have a look. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. The real deal. Daniel Ricciardo came into Formula 1 and very quickly established himself as a strong driver. He came through the Red Bull Academy, a notoriously ruthless junior team where only the finest drivers make it into Formula 1 and only the very best graduate from the second Red Bull F1 team to the top team. Ricciardo made this step look easy. He joined Red Bull in 2014, replacing Mark Webber, and was up against Sebastian Vettel, the driver that had won the last 4 Drivers' Championships back-to-back. The Australian driver immediately made an impact, beating the German 4-time champion over the course of his first season with the Red Bull team. At this point, Ricciardo was looking like the next driver to take over from Vettel as the lead of the team. He'd come in and proved he was the real deal. This was great for his stock in the sport. Many touted Ricciardo to be a future world champion, and he was doing everything that he needed to. Ricciardo secured his first 3 wins during that 2014 season alongside Vettel, while the 4-time champion failed to secure a single race win that year. From this point on, Vettel moved on to Ferrari, leaving Ricciardo to become the de facto #1 driver in the Red Bull team. This was a big step for the Australian driver, and at this moment it seemed like he would be the driver to lead the Austrian team back to the levels of success that they had enjoyed through the early 2010s. Ricciardo would continue with Red Bull as he collected 7 winners' trophies along the way, but Red Bull failed to offer him a car that could compete with Mercedes during this time. The Australian driver finished 3rd in the Drivers' Championship in both 2014 and 2016, being the lead non-Mercedes driver on both occasions. This achievement is significant and shows how he could score well, but was simply waiting for the right car. You could argue that the Red Bull was the strongest car from an aerodynamic perspective at some points during this time, as Mercedes had a large power unit advantage during this time compared to the Renault engines that Red Bull were using. So it was clear that Ricciardo was a champion in waiting, but it was something that was out of his control that would derail his career. Ricciardo's teammate from 2016 was Max Verstappen, and if most people believed that Ricciardo would be a future champion, I think everyone was confident that Verstappen would be a world champion. When the pair became teammates in 2016, it felt like there was a question mark over who would be the team leader, and over the following 2 years it became clear that the Dutch driver was the one that the team were wanting to build around. In this sport, F1 drivers have to set the expectation and goal to beat their teammate. At the beginning of each season, the 2 drivers are given the same machinery and the same opportunity to deliver results for their team. Some teams operate with a star driver and a supporting driver, and this is the model that delivered the excellent results for the Red Bull team from 2010 to 2013. Having Sebastian Vettel at the top and Mark Webber supporting was a recipe for success, even if it did create some tension at times, with the Multi-21 incident at the 2013 race in Malaysia being the boiling point. A similar team setup worked for Mercedes from 2017 to 2020 and for Red Bull once again more recently. So, as Daniel Ricciardo looked at the situation in the Red Bull setup, with Max Verstappen signing a long-term deal with the team, the Australian driver had to question whether he would be the lead driver in the Red Bull team in the years to come. It's now been confirmed that Ricciardo was offered a deal with the same salary as Verstappen, in a deal that was agreed with the late Dietrich Mateschitz. This offer was a huge moment, and it would have gone a long way for Ricciardo to feel like he was equal to Verstappen, but he still opted to walk away. To this point, Daniel Ricciardo had competed well with Verstappen. He outscored him in 2016 and 2017, but was beaten through the 2018 season. Though, in 2018, it was clear that Ricciardo had the worst of the bad luck in the Red Bull team, and the pair would have been much closer, or Ricciardo would have even been ahead if some luck had gone the other way. So in 2018, Ricciardo was still at the top of his game. He was a force to be reckoned with in the sport, but he wasn't confident that he would stay at the top of the Red Bull team. This situation, combined with the fact that he wasn't convinced by the team's 2019 move to Honda power units, meant he made the move to Renault. The move to Renault was always going to be a risk. The French team had struggled in the sport ever since they came back, and they've always been a team that seemed comfortable in the best of the rest spot behind the top teams. However, Ricciardo made the move to be a lead driver and take a gamble on this team. And for these 2 years, it worked well. Particularly in 2020, Daniel Ricciardo had one of his finest seasons in the sport, as he finished 5th in the drivers' standings with 2 podium finishes. It was a brilliant season for him and another sign that he was the real deal, just not in a team that could compete with the best teams in Formula 1. And if you want to see Ricciardo get back to his best in Formula 1, then you should definitely subscribe to Behind the Drive. From hero to zero. In a move that came before the 2020 season even began, Daniel Ricciardo made the switch to McLaren. This move, on paper, looked sensible. The team were making progress with Renault engines, and they actually got back to 3rd in the Constructors' Championship in 2020, moving ahead of Ferrari that had their poor season from a power unit perspective. It was a sign of their strong progress, and with Ricciardo coming into the team to replace Sainz, it seemed like they would have a strong and experienced driver pairing, as Ricciardo would be alongside Norris. But Ricciardo's first year with McLaren was dreadful. He was a long way behind his teammate, and his driving style fundamentally didn't work with the car. Ricciardo has enjoyed his success in the sport from smooth driving inputs, with early braking to carry the maximum speed possible through the apex of the corner. Though this is not what the Australian driver is known for, given his late braking overtakes have become his trademark over the years. But fundamentally, the 2021 McLaren didn't respond well to the driving style of Ricciardo. The front end reportedly didn't grip well with the smooth inputs, and as such the driver had little confidence through the corners. This situation would be enough to leave any driver in a position where they'd be doubting themselves, but as the 2021 season went on, it was clear that Ricciardo was struggling to adapt to his new car. Of course, alongside this in 2021, there were moments of brilliance, and in particular the Australian driver's first and only non-Red Bull win came in Monza of that year. But it was just a one-off event, and for the rest of the year, for the most part, Ricciardo was well beaten by Norris in the same machinery. So in Ricciardo's efforts to leave Red Bull and be a clear lead driver, he'd failed to deliver, and he was in a position heading into the new aerodynamic regulations where he wasn't where he wanted to be again, and certainly not the lead driver. Ricciardo's 2022 season should have been an opportunity to redeem himself. The new aerodynamic regulation set meant that all the cars would have to be built from the ground up, so the driver was hopeful that the bad characteristics of the 2021 car would have gone away. However, this wasn't the case. After all, it was still a car that was developed by the McLaren team, and they'd seen some success in 2021 with it. So Ricciardo's driving style continued to be an issue for him, particularly in low-speed corners. But also, there's an argument that could be made that these new cars don't suit Ricciardo's driving style. With McLaren, Ricciardo tried to adapt his driving style to counteract his weakness, and on this occasion, this just made the situation worse for him before he was dropped from the team. So Ricciardo left McLaren with his reputation in tatters. He was dropped a year early from his contract, and there were doubts about whether his driving style was fundamentally flawed. And for me, Ricciardo's time with McLaren revealed his inability to be adaptable and find a way to make it work. The fact that he tried and failed to change his driving style was a bad sign, and this certainly cast doubts over his ability to go to another team and get back to his best. Ricciardo had hit rock bottom, and there were doubts over his ability, but he found a way to get back towards Formula 1 in a return to the Red Bull group. Something's just not working. Ricciardo's return to Red Bull was in a marketing role. He dropped so low from the heights of where he was when he left the team in 2018. There were doubts over much of his ability to compete in the sport, but by joining Red Bull he was at least working with a setup with 4 seats on the F1 grid. Ricciardo got his opportunity with AlphaTauri in 2023, and this seemed like the beginning of a redemption arc for the driver. He'd run in a test with Red Bull after being described as having bad habits in the simulator, and within this test at Silverstone, Ricciardo performed well, showing that he could compete with the lap times of Verstappen at the same circuit. At 34 years old, Ricciardo doesn't seem to have long left in his career, and he's certainly not achieved everything that was expected of him early in his time in Formula 1. So by returning to the grid with a team that helped him develop right at the start of his career, this seemed like a good move for Ricciardo. He would also have an eye on the 2025 seat with Red Bull. Ricciardo's now up against Yuki Tsunoda, a driver that has struggled to convince Red Bull that he's the right driver for the role. So really, Ricciardo needs to comfortably beat the Japanese driver if he wants to continue his Formula One career. 2023 was hampered by the driver's wrist fracture, which put him on the sidelines for 5 races right at the beginning of his return to the sport. But even when he did return, he wasn't particularly convincing. He had one great race in Mexico, but outside of that, he struggled to beat Tsunoda. To an extent, I can forgive Ricciardo for the disappointing results in 2023. He wasn't up to speed and had spent some time on the sidelines. But so far in 2024, I don't think Ricciardo's come off the back of his pre-season training and shown a marked improvement. He's still struggling to compete with Tsunoda, and in Saudi Arabia in qualifying he was half a second behind his less experienced teammate. But what's worse is that he described the situation as a mystery. This is something that suggests that the driver has got some confidence issues and is struggling with something fundamental that he can't put his finger on. This reminds me of where he was in the McLaren against Norris, which is a dangerous place to be. Of course, it may emerge that he had an issue with the car, but at this point, Ricciardo has not been convincing. In a year where he must achieve strong results to give himself a chance of getting back into the top team that he left by choice 6 years ago, he's not come out of the starting blocks well, and perhaps this is down to the fact that these cars don't suit him. With the ground effect aerodynamics, these cars will never have the same levels of downforce through low speed corners, and this is where he seems to have particular challenges. But a key element to be successful in the sport is adapting to change, and finding a way to make the most of your car. Ricciardo did show that he could perform in the Red Bull in the high-speed circuit of Silverstone last year, at least in a test session, but he seems like he's unable to match this in the RB so far this year when it comes to real racing. I still believe Ricciardo is a strong driver and he's not performing at the level that he is capable of. However, I also believe that we will never see the Ricciardo that did so well with Renault and with Red Bull. He's lost a lot of confidence and his driving style doesn't seem to allow him to get the most out of these ground effect cars, and this seems to have coincided with Ricciardo's downfall.